the immediate surroundings and the site itself. The view of the site as we're standing on Westmount Road looking to the east towards the Barrel Yards project. You can see Natalie referred to the grade change, and it is fairly dramatic. The back of the Herb Street properties and then the first part of the Westmount Plaza site is sort of where the grade transitions. If we look along the south side of Herb Street, we can see the Westmount Grand building right at the corner of Urban Westmount. There's an office building and a 7-story building on the opposite corner. Office insurance company on one side, and then as we head further down Westmount, we see the mid and then higher rise buildings on the west side of Westmount. And then finally on Sunshine, the building that Natalie referred to, the 9-story building, that's effectively right across from the Dietz frontage of this property. So to answer some of the questions that Council was asking of Mr. Kent, when we looked at the site, we started at the highest level of planning. We looked at the provincial policy statement, we looked at the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Do those documents support the intensification of this property? We found that they did, and we were of the opinion that they do. Then we looked to the region's official plan. Is this the right location for intensification from the regional official plan perspective? And that plan would support it. And then we looked at the City of Waterloo's official plan, and that's where we did a deeper dive into the policy framework. And as Natalie noted, the property, the entirety of the property, is in the major node. So we have a major node, all of this property, the gas station on the other side of Father David Bauer Drive, all of the lands on the west side of Westmount Road heading towards the intersection with University Avenue, and then the balance of the surrounding properties are in a minor corridor until we get to the Uptown and the Urban Growth Center boundaries. So there's an established intent for intensification on this property, on these properties, and then on the properties along the minor corridor, and then further intensification as you head towards the Uptown. So with that in mind, we looked at, as Andrew was talking about, how can you develop a project or a development of this scale on this size of a property. They're very rare opportunities in Waterloo region to get a parcel with over 7 hectares that you are able to design. But it does have some constraints and some direction that we had to respect. Part of that was retaining and what it serves for the community and the different amenities that it offers, retaining sun life and the employment that it brings to the site, and then the constraints associated with the flood plain that Natalie put up on one of her slides. So the floodplain effectively runs through the site out towards Dietz Avenue. So it actually, in order to achieve safe access, almost forces the development towards Herb Street if you are going to put residential development on this property. You can't put residential development in this location because it's in the middle of the floodplain. Then we looked at, if we're going to move the development towards Herb Street, what are some of the other surrounding uses that we talked about on the earlier slides. So first we start with the only abutting property owner and what kind of development is existing there and what is planned for there. So this part of the Luther Village property is actually designated. It has 2 different designations, permissions up to 40 meters, even though there are only townhomes there today. So we recognize that this was a sensitive interface, notwithstanding its planned permissions of 40 meters, and notwithstanding that this part of the site is already zoned in the new bylaw for 81 meters. We wanted to be sensitive to that interface, and that was another reason why we wanted to move the development further away from that interface and closer to Herb Street. So as Natalie alluded to, this building actually has 4-story, 7-story, and then it's all the way over here is where you get to 11 stories. And it meets all of the tower separation regulations in the new zoning bylaw. And this is a parking structure which will eventually serve the employees of Sun Life. And again, it's a 3-story structure with an open-air 4th level. And then we looked at, how do people move around this site? So if we have the development fronting on Herb Street, how do they get into the existing part of the site, and how do they get into the new part of the site? We have an existing access on Westmount Road. We have an existing access off Father David Bauer Drive. There is an existing access off Dietz Avenue now that's used primarily for the Sun Life parking area. So we wanted to maintain an access off Dietz Avenue and not create too many more accesses on the regional roads. So the primary access from Dietz Avenue will be as the shared street that we alluded to earlier. So the purpose of the shared street is to create all along this spine green spaces, open spaces for employees of Sun Life, for residents of Luther Village, for residents who live south of this site in the neighborhood to the south, as well as residents who will move into these buildings. Places for them to gather, places for them to visit the commercial uses, and places for them to interact in a social way. So rather than concentrate all of the amenity in this project on the rooftops or in 7th floor or 10th floor indoor amenity spaces so that the residents become isolated from the community, we wanted to bring the residents out of the buildings and bring the community into the site. So that was the genesis for the Flex Street or the Winnerf Street. And then we looked at, well, we don't want all the traffic and all the people who are coming to the site to use this Flex Street. So we've created a right-in, right-out access off Erb Street. And the idea here is if I'm traveling westbound on Erb Street, I can turn into the site and I can access this. If I'm a resident of the building, be for residents only, I can access this parking structure and I can access this parking structure. So that way it splits the traffic onto the regional roads as appropriate, with the existing entrance here, which largely serves the plaza and the Sun Life, and then some access off Dietz Avenue for the buildings that might be closer there. Natalie's shown some of these. So what the idea here with concentrating the commercial uses on the internal street was that we wanted to complement the existing Westmount Plaza rather than push the commercial uses out towards Dietz Avenue or Erb Street and draw customers away from the plaza onto the perimeter of the site. We wanted to work with the plaza and augment the plaza, and so that there would be some interaction between the commercial uses that are there today and those that would be there as part of the redevelopment. The Erb Street buildings will have residential units facing the street. The idea here is that Erb Street right now, notwithstanding the spiritual use, is largely characterized by residential uses, so it will have a residential feel to it with walk-up units facing the street. The mixed-use part of these buildings will actually be behind and facing the internal street. This is looking towards Westmount Street up here, so a public park entryway into the site from Westmount Road, and we can see that this structure, which is actually partially 2 floors below grade if you're standing on Erb Street, presents itself for some active commercial spaces on the internal street. Another reason why we decided to focus those active spaces, the commercial active spaces on the internal street, to take advantage of the grades and design accordingly. So you can see that the design of the Flex Street is meant to be equally shared amongst vehicles, pedestrians, and cyclists, and we expect there to be a lot of movement amongst the site, so it won't be a highway for vehicles. So this is a broader view of the Flex Street, so Dietz Avenue in this location, the stepped building I alluded to earlier, some additional office complementing the Sun Life building here, and then looking down the Flex Street with its public spaces towards the park in the previous image, and then the other existing mid and high-rise buildings in the immediate area. So in terms of our official plan amendment, quickly I'll summarize it. Effectively, we wanted to start with one land use designation rather than having a residential and a commercial designation effectively going through the middle of buildings. We wanted to start with one land use designation and then work from there. We wanted to designate the lands along Erb Street for greater height, as I alluded to earlier, and then introduce some specific provision area policies to address some of the design and transition matters that we've spoken about, namely to allow the commercial uses to be oriented towards Dietz Avenue and Erb Street rather than, or to the internal street rather than Dietz Avenue, which we feel is more of a residential character. So we wanted to build in a special policy that would allow ground floor residential on Dietz Avenue and Erb Street because they have a more residential character. We didn't want to increase, even though the request itself on paper would be termed high density. We don't want to build high density buildings along Dietz Avenue. We, in fact, would lower the height of this portion of the site and maintain that 40-meter height along Dietz Avenue, and then to permit the minor reduction in the gross leasable commercial area for the site that Natalie spoke to. And it's important for council to distinguish the gross leasable area requirement on this site actually doesn't allow you to count office uses towards that minimum requirement. And this site actually has a fair amount of office use, and we're introducing more, but we're not able to count that gross leasable area towards that minimum requirement, and that's in large part why we need that special policy. So we look at the existing zoning, C181, as Natalie spoke about. So the main component of the request is really just this part of the site to rezone the balance of the lands with some of those site specifics to deal with the transition along Dietz Avenue, residential permissions at grade. There's an underground parking structure along Herb Street, so it's actually 1.9 meters until we hit this line here, but there's a jog in the property fabric actually where you hit these last few properties along Herb Street, and that's why it goes down to 0.6 just for this last stretch. But that's the only location where that setback or any setback relief is required. We look at the when we were designing the site, the tower regulations in the new zoning bylaw. So they all have the towers all have podiums. They all meet the tower separation, both internal and external, particularly along the Luther Village boundary. They all meet the tower horizontal tower dimensions. They all meet the footprint requirements, and they all have step backs from the podium. The only parts of the buildings that don't meet the 3-meter requirement for step back are these corner features you can see that are on the buildings. Those corner features are a 2-meter step back rather than the required 3. Some of the buildings have 12-meter step backs. So in terms of the height, just to put up a slide that really I hope clarifies things, the idea here is the orange is your existing 40-meter permission. All of the pale color is existing 81, so there actually is 81-meter permission along Dietz Avenue. We are going to limit the height along Dietz Avenue in this box to 40 meters and introduce more height in the hatched area. The property itself would be permitted over 5,000 bedrooms, and the project is proposing 1,400. It equates to about 200 bedrooms per hectare, and even if you subtracted the Westmount Plaza and argued, well, you're not really developing the Westmount Plaza, and said you're only developing the other half of the site, it would still be under 400 bedrooms per hectare, which is less than the permitted density along Dietz Avenue in the new zoning bylaw. So it's not a very dense development in terms of its residential permissions. And then we look at the city's height and density schedule. So the lands on the south side of Herb Street are actually designated for 12 stories, 40 meters. We have employment, high density to the west, and we have medium density to the east, and we have the Luther Village, which again is medium high and medium. So the property is actually surrounded by lands that are planned for anything from medium to high density development, and we felt it was an appropriate location to locate some intensification because it was well buffered from low density areas. In terms of transportation, of course, we looked at that, and Matt Brower from Paradigm Transportations is here this evening if there are any specific questions about transportation. There's several existing transit routes that serve the property, including a number of them immediately abut the subject lands with a bus stop right at Herb and Westmount. There are cycling lanes on a portion of Herb and Father David Bauer. There's planned lanes on Herb Street west or east of Westmount, as well as on Westmount Road. The only real loss of service or level of service issue in the area in terms of traffic is the left turn. If you're heading north on Westmount and you want to turn left on to go west onto Herb Street, the turning lane isn't of adequate depth to handle that traffic, as anyone, myself included, who has traveled along there would well know. There is an eastbound left turn lane warranted from Herb Street onto Dietz Avenue today. So it would be warranted under current and proposed conditions, with or without the development. None of the unsignalized intersections warrant signalization. And then to alleviate some of the turning movements on or from Dietz onto Herb Street, the report recommends that a right turn lane be created so you can turn right from Dietz and head west on Herb Street. So in conclusion, and to summarize things, we did look at all the planning documents, starting at the provincial level and working our way through the regional and municipal level, and we felt this was an appropriate location for the redevelopment that we've put forward, and that the Herb Street frontage was an appropriate area for some increase in height, with the height transitioning towards Westmount and Herb, where the existing fabric already includes a number of buildings of similar or medium and high density development. So we feel that the development itself introduces, it's one of the rare developments actually that can speak to a complete community. It has jobs, it has residents, it has shopping, it has your weekly needs. So you can work here and shop here, you can live here and shop here, you can live here and you can work here. And there aren't too many developments that can say that all on the same property, and we felt that was another strong attribute. And then we feel that the design of the site addresses all of the public street frontages, and we're happy with the work that, I'm very pleased with Andrew Bousfield Architects and the work that they've done, and Andrew and Ashley from ABA Architects are here this evening if council has specific questions about the wonderful design they've done.
Thank you, Trevor. Questions of clarification for Delegate Councillor Freeman, Councillor Bonagor?
Through you, Mayor Jaworski. So I'm just trying to better understand the parking requirements. I see that in the parking justification study you have the breakdown, but the number of units listed there appears to be different than what's in the planning justification study. You've listed the number of units here as 1,014, but in the planning justification it was listed as 1,360.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, there's 1,014 units. The proposed parking rate is 0.6 spaces per unit for residents.
Well, can we look at these reports and get the numbers right? Because I'm trying to also understand how much bike parking you're providing relative to the proposed bylaw. And because as it is right now, I don't know what is the right number, but if you use the 1360 in the justification report, that means according to the bylaw, you would need 1,496 and you're providing 1,526, which allows 30 parking spaces effectively for 38,000 square meters of commercial. And so I'm trying to understand, do you expect, the 1,195 parking spaces down to 30 that everyone's coming by bike or bus? And so I'm trying to rationalize that. And by the way, it's in so many places, I'm finding it frustrating. So in a future application, can we actually have a site plan that gives me a matrix on the site plan that actually shows what's happening on this site? Because I find it really confusing going through 3 reports. And with regard to the parking justification report, it will be helpful to really double down on how it is we expect these parking spaces to be used and or shared. And I'm not commenting per se on the rate. I just want to better understand it. With regard to the bike parking too, if we can get a breakdown of Class A versus Class B, I think that's going to be really helpful. And also whether or not you plan to allow Class A bike parking to support the actual commercial operations, or whether you're planning to create Class A only within storage lockers, for example, that would be exclusive use to the residential. It would be really helpful for this development to consider some kind of bike shelters if you're really leaning in on that much alternative transportation use. Yeah, I don't know. I have tons of questions, but those are the ones I was focusing on right now. I'll wait and see if more pop to the surface. Okay. But I do think addressing the transportation corridors and how you expect people to use this site and where you expect them to be if they're not in a car will be incredibly helpful.
Next up, Councillor Bonagor, Henry Vasek.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski. Thank you for the extra information. I saved some questions for you. When Natalie was giving the overview, she mentioned a couple of places where you'd be requesting fairly significant reductions in the setbacks. Can you, given that you've got such a lot of land to be working with, what's the reasoning behind that kind of encroachment into the public space?
So the through your Mayor Jaworski to Councillor Bonagor, the only setback relief we're requesting is for the underground structure that runs from here to here along Herb Street. So from here to here, the setback is 1.9 meters underground. And then from here to the corner, it's 0.6 because there's a jog in the property fabric. The rest of the site meets the setbacks.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, then the setbacks are underground. It wouldn't
Underground.
affect the street.
You would not
setbacks.
see them.
Okay. First question done. Thank you. With the Flux Street, as you're calling it, from the look of the entry and exits to the buildings, it strikes me that that could actually carry a fair amount of traffic. And while I understand the idea is for it to be low speed traffic because it's a shared zone, do you have some design ideas as to how you can actually affect driver behaviour to ensure that that's the case?
Through you again, Mayor Jaworski, I think the detailed design of a site of this scale will have to wait a little bit further. I think we do have some ideas for sure. We have a team of transportation engineers and landscape architects who will be working to figure out the best way to manage the flow of traffic, which we would expect naturally. There'll be some traffic that comes off Dietz Avenue, but it does, the advantage of a site like this is you do have multiple accesses, and we've tried to reduce the pressure on Dietz Avenue by making those other accesses available and enticing. So that's one strategy, and then the other strategy will be some design techniques that we'll be working through on our side and then in collaboration with staff as well.
So I'm getting a bit ahead of myself there, okay. This is a very large project. Can you give us an idea of the timeline that you're looking at? What would you start with and how long would the entire thing take?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I've fortunately, I know Ms. Hardacre fairly well, having worked a long time with her. We've been in constant communication.
From the applicant's perspective, we don't always get that. I think that's a helpful addition to ask different kinds of questions about where this is going. So I had a few for you. One, Natalie in her presentation spoke to how staff would review the request for a change in height along Herb Street, and if the review of policies suggested that yes, this was the right location and could handle and warrant all of those, then they'd look to, staff would look to Section 37 to be able to dispense with that. I remember reviewing planning documents that you provided that are available online. I didn't see any mention of that, so I was just curious as to the applicant's view of staff's approach on this matter.
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, I know when I come here, I'm going to get very good questions from Councillor Henry, so I always try to prepare myself. Natalie has already alerted us to the fact that staff's preference is that this